Hi, BookTube, and welcome to part two of our three-part blog that's looking at Adam Zamoyski's book, 1812, Napoleon's Fatal March on Moscow. Now, as per the new script format that I'm developing for these multi-part vlogs, what we're going to start with is just a little look at the book in general, and then we're going to carry on where we left off last time, and I'm going to comment on chapters 10 through 18. Now that I've reached the two-thirds point in this book, I think it's a good time, an appropriate time, to talk about the style. Adam Zamoyski never had an academic career, and so he hasn't had to produce that kind of heavy-going prose style that we all recognize in academic writing. And I know academics themselves worry about this. They worry about history that isn't written in academic style. They feel it's somehow less fastidious, there's less attention to detail, there's more opportunity for people to consider the subjective to be objective fact. Let's take an example from Zamoyski's book to show the difference. On page 17 he writes, Peter the Great had done much to modernize his kingdom, and he put it on the map by building a fancy new capital at St. Petersburg. Well, nobody who wants to have academic tenure would ever say something like fancy new capital. They just wouldn't. But this is why I wish academia would change. I wish they would work on a writing style that is more approachable, publications which are more accessible. If they're worried that people will mistake stylistic choices for indisputable fact, well, that's only a problem when you hold back a good humanities education from the majority of people. If you make a humanities education expensive and exclusive, then you've got to accept that the majority of people are going to learn about Napoleon from the mass media. And quite frankly, Adam Zamoyski's book is a huge improvement on education by mass media. I think also the physical details about this book need commending. There's generous white space, as you can see. This is a photograph of my copy. Generous white space all around the text. That had a very relaxing effect on me as a reader. I would say that it fooled my brain into thinking that I was reading a novel rather than a non-fiction work. The text somehow seemed less intimidating. And this paperback edition, look, if anybody knows what I'm supposed to call this format, please leave a comment. The book itself opened up easily, and it stayed open without me having to hold the pages apart. The photograph you see here is my copy lying flat on a table without any other assistance. I'm very tough on my books because spine wrinkles mean absolutely nothing to me, but I am not seeing any spine wrinkles forming in spite of me. So I would say the cover material must be more resistant to folding. There are 59 illustrations. They're all black and white, as you can see some samples here. They're printed on the same paper as the text. They are inserted in 3 clusters of unnumbered pages, and they mainly show artwork depicting personalities or artwork done during the 1812 march and retreat. There are also 24 maps which interrupt the text at appropriate points, and those will diagram battle positions and troop movements. Right, we'll work our way through the chapters now, starting with chapter 10, titled The Heart of Russia. The main aim of this chapter was to outline the political challenges that were facing Tsar Alexander once Napoleon entered Russian territory. Those territories closest to Russia's border were recently conquered, and of course their loyalties would be questionable because they didn't share Russia's language, they didn't share ethnicity, or the Orthodox Christian faith. In every country Napoleon had conquered previously as well, he emancipated the Jews, and Alexander really could not be sure how the Jewish populations inside his borders would react to the invasion. Zamoyski isn't able to give us numbers. All he can say is that many Jews did aid the French, and also a number proved loyal to the Tsar, surprisingly, since I don't think that loyalty was ever reciprocated. This chapter also focuses on the first battle for Smolensk. It's a city that's presently in western Russia near the border with Belarus. It was 4 days of fighting with 24,000 men lost, and that's not including an unknown quantity from the city's 13,000 inhabitants. And yet neither side was victorious. The Russians weren't able to hold on to Smolensk, but by retreating, they denied Napoleon a decisive victory. As a point of minor interest, Tsar Alexander worried a great deal also about his serfs. They constituted 90% of the population, but they had no rights. They were treated as property. Police presence was increased in various provinces, and Zamoyski notes this very interesting statistic. He says, there would be 67 minor peasant revolts in 32 different provinces in the course of 1812, more than twice the national average, meaning on any given year there were at least, 30-something peasant revolts going on in different parts of Russia. Chapter 11, I won't go into much detail. It describes the demoralization that was caused by the whole fiasco of Smolensk on the French side, but also the panic generated in Moscow as news reached the city that the advance of Napoleon's troops had not been stopped. And that dovetails nicely into Chapter 12. Previous chapters said enough for the reader to know that General Barclay, who was overall in command of the Russian army, was disliked by his fellow generals. That was partly because of his ethnicity. He was Prussian, he was not Russian. And after the retreat from Smolensk, there was enough power behind all these intrigues and rumors that spread to St. Petersburg to convince Tsar Alexander that he really needed to replace Barclay with an ethnic Russian. And he chose his grandmother's hero, Kutuzov. Kutuzov may have had all that in his favor, but he was 67 years old, with a reputation for being undisciplined and secretive. He led forces at the next battle, the Battle for Borodino, 166 kilometers east from Smolensk and only 4 days' march from Moscow. Zamoyski believes that Kutuzov would have been completely defeated in that battle had Napoleon been in good health. However, the French emperor was suffering from occasional attacks of dysuria, an infection which increased his temperature, caused swelling in his joints, and also Napoleon had difficulty urinating. Added to this, or perhaps causing it, was sleep deprivation, because Napoleon would use the night as cover to go ride out and inspect the enemy's encampments, fortifications, the general lay of the land. As a minor point of interest, on the evening before the battle for Borodino, a courier arrived from Paris at Napoleon's camp with a portrait of his son Napoleon II. Here's how the book describes the painting. It says, "The King of Rome, lying in his cradle, toying with a miniature orb and scepter." The book itself didn't provide a copy of this picture, so I just had to go on Google, and this picture that you see here is the one that I could find that seems to fit that description. Chapter 13, it's a rather misleading chapter title, The Battle for Moscow. We're actually describing the battle for Borodino, which was 4 days' march away from Moscow, but symbolically it was the last stand on the part of the Russians to hold back Napoleon's army. It was difficult reading about this battle not to conclude that this was really just another Smolensk, nobody really wins kind of war, but on a much, much greater scale. Details of the fighting were different because Kutuzov had constructed some earthworks, and now might be a good time to mention the Ravsky Redoubt, which was a semicircular enclosure of earth, which it couldn't be easily defended by the Russians, and if the French took it, they couldn't hold it very well once it was taken. I don't really understand the purpose of it. It effectively trapped whichever side held possession of it, and that resulted in hundreds and hundreds of pointless deaths. And what also seems stupid, and I speak as a fool, perhaps, was the French insistence on positioning cavalry units within range of enemy guns, and then keeping them standing there while the Russians fired on them. I'm reading now from page 276. The captain of the Saxon cavalry pointed out that to be made to stand still under fire must be one of the most unpleasant things that cavalry can be called on to do. There can have been scarcely a man in those ranks and files whose neighbor did not crash to earth with his horse or die from terrible wounds while screaming for help. A captain of cuirassiers rode down the line of his squadron to keep his men steady under the withering fire. He congratulated one of his subalterns by the name of Gramont on his bearing, just as he was telling me that he lacked for nothing except perhaps a glass of water. A cannonball tore him in two, wrote the captain. I turned to another officer to tell him how sorry I was to have lost this Monsieur de Gramont, but before he could answer me, his horse was hit by a cannonball which killed him, and 100 other incidents of this sort. Zamoyski says that Borodino was the greatest massacre in recorded history. The numbers lost were not surpassed until the First Battle of the Somme in 1916. And the picture that you see here on screen are some of those victims being unearthed because there was no time to deal with the wounded or the dead on the battlefield as the Russians retreated because they were that close to Moscow and Napoleon advanced. And so these bodies were left unburied or buried naturally, and they're just now being gathered up and being given, I guess, a consecrated burial. The main aim of chapter 14 is to describe Napoleon's anticlimactic entry with his army into Moscow, whereas it would be typical in European battles of the time for the victorious general to be met by some group who had been invested with authority by his enemy, and they would officially surrender. But this didn't happen to Napoleon. No one came out from the Russian capital as the Grande Armée approached. No one came out to greet the emperor or discuss terms of surrender. And when he did come inside the city, he found it impossible to meet with anyone of importance. The city had lost about 2/3 of its inhabitants. The city police superintendent had been instructed, as the troops came nearer, to set fire to any supplies and anything else he could. And he was probably unofficially assisted by the Russian army themselves as they were retreating out of the city, and criminal elements. Prevailing winds, of course, spread that fire. And so Napoleon had no sooner got into the city, tried to set up a command headquarters, but he had to take it out of the city again to a nearby country estate until that fire had died down. And the lack of inhabitants also made it difficult for Napoleon to do something that had worked for him in other victories, and that is to hire people to act as propaganda agents. Usually these would be the leaders of rebel groups who were looking for an opportunity to agitate, but he couldn't find anyone to do this for him and take that agitation out beyond Moscow. We should begin talking about chapter 15 with a quote from Zamoyski. This is how he describes Tsar Alexander's generals after the Battle of Borodino. He calls them a gaggle of petulant, squabbling schoolchildren, and many of them were writing to their ruler to tattle on each other. In other parts of Russian society, loyalties were no more predictable. Zamoyski looks closely at how nobles and serfs responded to the French invasion and Tsar Alexander's requests for more fighting men. It's a mixed picture. And I think it would take a more detailed study before one could start talking in percentages. For example, how many peasants helped their own troops and how many assisted Napoleon. This chapter also notes how Kutuzov moved his army southwest of Moscow while the city was occupied. And that was a good decision because he moved them closer to good food supply, and he strengthened his troops, therefore, with rest, with good rations, new recruits, and winter clothing. And as a point of minor interest, although I would say it was a bit more than minor actually, it really took me aback. On page 332, Zamoyski nonchalantly mentions a female cavalry officer in 1812. Yeah, naturally, I had to Google it. And the woman in question was Nadezhda Durova. Initially, she disguised herself as a man and she called herself Alexander Durov. She was found out, but that did not hinder her ambitions. She was allowed to continue to serve until 1816, and she retired with the rank of captain. Her memoirs are available in print, and you're going to find a link to second-hand copies in my description box if you're interested. In chapter 16, Napoleon returns to Moscow after the fires have died down. Zamoyski here makes extensive use of the soldiers' diaries and their correspondence. He's trying to portray their life in Moscow for that short stay. As apparent victors, it would have been a soldier's expectation that they could be rewarded with the valuable things that they found in the city, items they could sell when they returned home to make their fortune or to compensate for all their hardships, but also to give as gifts to their loved ones. For those troops who were stationed inside Moscow's walls, those things were obtainable, as well as reasonable food and shelter. Not so for those companies who were ordered to station themselves outside the city, particularly the cavalry units, because fodder for the horses still remained a huge problem. And I found Napoleon's reaction really telling here, because when warnings were communicated to him from the cavalry commanders, he dismissed and denied that there was any issue about food. The chapter expands on this denial, and it presents evidence that Napoleon delayed a decision about what to do next with his army, because the only logical move was to withdraw from Moscow, and this was a truth he wasn't prepared to acknowledge. A point of minor interest, a number of Napoleon's soldiers believed a rumor that his next military aim was to take the Grand Army to India and deprive the British of one of their most lucrative and strategic colonies. Now, I'm laughing, and that's because there was so little army left. I don't think they realized. And certainly in my description box, you'll see there's a link to a Wikipedia article describing a secret plan that had been in discussion between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander's father, Paul, before Paul was assassinated. But neither ruler, I don't think, had properly considered the logistics of that kind of war and the geography. I mean, according to the Wikipedia article, Tsar Paul didn't even own any maps of India. Chapter 17, The March to Nowhere, it begins with a speculation. Was Kutuzov's inactivity, keeping his troops away from Moscow for the most part, was it a strategy to lull Napoleon into a false sense of security and keep him in Moscow until winter started? We don't get a definite answer. Kutuzov as a personality tended toward inactivity anyway, and also the men who served under him often ignored the orders that he did give. Napoleon, on the other hand, living in the Kremlin, showed signs of having lost his characteristic decisiveness. It was an unexpected attack by Russian forces on the French troops who were stationed outside the city that seemed to suddenly reboot the emperor, and a decision to evacuate the city was made suddenly on the 18th of October. And it dismayed me to see, of course, Zamoyski's account of the panicked and undisciplined nature of this withdrawal. I'm going to read now from page 365. The commotion in the city as news of the impending departure spread was indescribable. Large numbers of civilians, who feared being lynched by the mob once the French army was gone, decided to follow it. While they were mostly from the French colony, they included other foreigners, among them at least one Englishwoman, the wife of a Polish merchant. They also included a considerable number of Russians, particularly women and petty criminals who had thrown their lot in with the French or otherwise become attached to them. Their last-minute preparations only added to the confusion as the troops packed and loaded up. The city quickly filled with small traders, anxious to buy anything the French could not carry off with them, and with peasants from the surrounding countryside eager to rifle through whatever was left behind. But the soldiers of the Grande Armée were not going to leave behind anything they did not have to. One of the most damaging consequences of the fire was the large number of soldiers who had accumulated a stock of booty, which they hoped would, on their return to Western Europe, make their fortune. Probably as many as 8,000 had left the ranks to attend to the vehicles or pack animals on which they loaded their treasures. But they could not only make the journey home under cover of the army, whose movements they would impede at every step. Even disciplined soldiers were determined to hold on to their hard-gotten gains, as the case of Sergeant Adrien Bourgon shows. His knapsack contained several pounds of sugar, some rice, dry biscuit, half a bottle of liqueur, a Chinese silk dress embroidered with silver and gold thread, several small silver and gold items, his dress uniform, a lady's riding coat, 2 repoussé silver plaques, one representing the Judgment of Paris, the other Neptune in his chariot, several medallions, and a diamond-studded Russian decoration. In a large bag slung over his shoulder, he had a silver medallion representing Christ, a Chinese porcelain vase, and a number of other objects. This was all in addition to his full equipment, a spare pair of shoes, and 60 cartridges. After a few miles, he stopped by the roadside and sifted through his pack to see what he could jettison in order to lighten it. He decided to throw out the breeches of his dress uniform. Others would jettison cartridges and musket cleaning equipment. Artillerymen would throw out shells to make room in their gun carriages, and company wagons would be emptied of anvils, horseshoes, and nails in favor of the farrier's booty. In short, Napoleon's army left Moscow as if their victory was complete, as if there would be no more need for fighting. They suffered the consequences very soon after. The French troops marched along 2 different roads. Kutuzov took the advantage of attacking the southernmost convoy and forcing it northward, and so that meant that the volume of traffic on one road and the poor road conditions slowed down the French withdrawal, and slowness was deadly because it increased the quantity of supplies that were needed to keep the army alive. Chapter 18. You have to brace yourself for a catalogue of disastrous decisions and disastrous weather. For reasons I simply can't fathom, Napoleon retreated back to Borodino, literally marching his troops across the battlefield. Zamoyski says on page 379, quote, "It had never been cleared, and the dead had been left where they lay, to be pecked at and chewed by carrion crows, wolves, feral dogs, and other creatures. The stink was indescribable." The armies also encountered many wounded men left behind after that battle, for whom no medicines and no rations had been provided. Napoleon ordered the evacuation of all these wounded to come along with them, against the advice of doctors, who predicted correctly that most of these men were so weak that they would die from the upheaval and the jostling. October was unusually mild in 1812, but on the 6th of November, temperatures dropped overnight. Very few French soldiers had winter uniforms, and they were still sleeping outdoors. The first snowfall made the roads slippery, and the heavy artillery became difficult to move. No hand protection for the men meant that the metal muskets were impossible to hold. Many were discarded along the route march. And once again, the horses suffered. Without proper shoes to walk on packed snow and ice, they slipped, they broke bones, they had to be left to die. Prince Eugene, Napoleon's stepson and commander of the 4th Cavalry Corps, lost 1,200 horses in 2 days without fighting. That was a really difficult fact to end on, and this is a very difficult image to end with. But there really seemed no point in understating the complete waste of life. There have been many diagrams created to show exactly how many men lost their lives in the campaign of 1812. I'm going to show you just this one, this circular one. If you begin at the 12 o'clock position where the red band, is the thickest, that is when Napoleon entered Russian territory with his army of nearly 500,000 men. Bearing in mind, he'd lost many men before he reached Russian territory, but he had 500,000. And then if you move around the circle clockwise until you get to the 12 o'clock position again, where the line is thinnest, that is when Napoleon left Russian territory with just 10,000 men from his 500,000 man army. And where we are right now at the end of part 2 is at about the 8 o'clock position, the beginning of November, when he had about 60,000 men. So we have yet to see another 50,000 lives lost just in the retreat. It really amazes me. It makes me wonder what effect Napoleon's campaign had on the economy of France, the economy of Western Europe, with the loss of that many men and animals. If anybody knows a book that deals with that subject specifically, please leave a comment. I would really be interested to know. I have just over 100 pages left in Zamoyski's book, and I think I'm going to arrange a long reading session this weekend to finish it. It has been an incredible learning experience, but it's also an experience that I think now needs to be put out of its misery. I'll be back in a few days' time with another fiction review, and I wish everybody the best with their reading during the month of August. Okay, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.